What are your future plans going forward, especially
Very simple, to take over the governing of the country. That is our immediate objective that we want to make as soon as possible.
You're a prominent anti-apartheid political figure in South Africa who's been part of the African National Congress, which has recently expelled you from that political party. We know that you've challenged this issue. I just want to get what your views are, because globally, you have been known to be part of the ANC.
Well, there's a long story about that. If you ask that question, you are producing, we are making me to produce a very long kind of an answer. Firstly, as we have said, I joined the ANC at my young age. In fact, it was even before qualifying. I lied to the people who had to make me a member of the African National Congress. I was very young, just 17, when I joined. The reason why I did so, because the ANC is an organization that was established to liberate the people of this country. And it was established by the greater leadership of the black people in South Africa, when there was a clear apartheid kind of behavior that emerged from the British and the Afrikaners after the Anglo-Boer War. It became very clear that whites who had come to South Africa were taking over the country in terms of governing it, doing everything. And the black leaders in South Africa, which included, among others, traditional leaders who were in charge of the country that was taken from them, but secondly, the pastors who were preaching here, as well as our learned people who came together to say we cannot be taken out of the participation of running this country as the whites had decided to do. Those who were in the leading part of this were the British, who had to plead with the Afrikaners to allow themselves to take out the black people from any leadership thing in South Africa. And it was a serious matter that led the blacks to say, let us establish one party that will defend our own kind of interests. And that's how the African National Congress was established. And therefore, everyone was a member. Later on the year, because life is life, I'm sure there were other political parties that emerged in one form or the other. But the first thing was that we should be out of any activity that determines those who must run the country. It was a deliberate thing done by people who were the people who just arrived, found us here living in peace. And that's why the struggle had to start in a different fashion at that time. Now, if that is the case, the ANC therefore was my organization. And I grew within that party. And I fought. And I joined the army when the army came to fight, which was now more the Afrikaners who were now saying, after they won for the first time the elections, they said they were going to apply what belongs to them in terms of their beliefs. That a black man is a black man, is not a complete human being. Only whites were real human beings. And that led to us leading to an armed struggle to fight. In other words, almost to go back to where we were defending our countries from the beginning. It's a long, very difficult and painful story of this country. Now, once that was done, then they indeed increased what was called, popularly known, that the life in South Africa between black and white was strengthened to make the blacks feel the pinch, feel that the people who were white were superior, we were inferior in whatever way. And therefore ended up with a situation where there was a thing called apartheid. In other words, dividing the whites and the blacks, that they cannot be the same. And there are a lot of details how oppression increased from what the British would have made a kind of a thing that you were sort of just saying, you are here, you are with us, but you are under us, that kind of stuff. That led us to become freedom fighters and struggle and become soldiers and everything. It's a long, long, what to call. The main thing was that South Africa must be free. We must be equal. We must have everything in the same way as the white and the blacks. And it took a long time, I think the longest struggle in the continent of Africa. We became the first to start. We became the last to be, so to speak, free. The idea was to have South African free, fully, equal to everybody. There's a way these things were done. For an example, when there was a decision that we should be free, should be equal, a lot of difficult things were said. For an example, to say that let there be negotiations, which was never done when our country was taken. There was no negotiation. It was taken by force. But given the passage of time, we had to deal with that. When we went for negotiations, and perhaps unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, I was made to be one of the people who were part of starting that as a result of the decisions taken, and therefore agreed that we are going to negotiate. In other words, we are going to find a way where we could live together. But as we're negotiating, the time had been too much. The wars had been too bitter. And therefore we had to sit and talk. How are we going to negotiate? And I think we agreed that we'll negotiate. And after negotiating, we will make the country come together, because we've been fighting, killing one another, arresting one another. Many people had died in jail, in the battles or whatever. A decision was taken, supported by the world, that we need to bring peace and put South Africa back to where it is supposed to be. As a result of that, we decided the first term would be very difficult to deal with, because the anger and the problem among us was too deep. So we'd make the first term to be run in terms of government in the country by all of us, black and white. Parties that will win a particular number will then be the ones who will be part of a government that will be put together. We called it government of national unity. In other words, we're trying to unite these people who have been fighting for years. In other words, even the manner in which the agreements will be soft, to allow us to come together, to allow to accept that we can live together. After that first occasion, we'll then allow the party thereafter, after the first term, in the second term.
The ANC.
the party, whichever at the time, we did not know because we hadn't won. Whoever will win will be the one who will then determine how this country is run. And the party that emerged was the ANC. ANC, in other words, had its own policies, every other thing, that once we are in power, we will rule this country the way we want, which will be good for everybody else. Then, once we came there, the movement to change was very slow. But nevertheless, everything, times we needed to give it time, etc. I personally felt we were not rushing to change. There are things that are written in serious documents that we, when we are in charge of the country, this is what we will do. Very little of that was happened. I mean, just to put it mildly. We ended up with an emphasis on what we call the equal rights to everybody. That was done. But it was not actually done to do it. Some of the things that were supposed to be done, they were never done.
In the Freedom Charter?
The Freedom Charter, for an example, is a key document. If you look at it seriously, it was equal rights that were attended to in the Freedom Charter. What the Freedom Charter says was never attended to. And you would have felt, therefore, that with time we are going to address the issue. But the issue was never addressed up to this day. It's now 30 years. It has never been addressed. Instead, we were going backwards rather than going forward as this organization. Now, as the time went, it was worrying. We finally ended up with a situation where the leadership that came was no longer even thinking about anything. If anything, it was reversing many, many things. As a current
ANC.
I always forget this name at times.
I feel like I'm getting a political lecture from you at this point, His Excellency. I do want you to touch on that issue then, on that ANC that you mentioned that has made this journey to this point, which has expelled you, which you were part of. You joined at an early age of 17 years old, which has now expelled you. I know you've challenged this issue, but what are your views about them actually expelling you?
I'm starting like this because I want you to have a clear thing, because people at times misinterpret things. Even in that one, I'm going to come, because we started with at the beginning that I'm being challenged and I'm challenging people. It was part of this history that I'm talking about, wherein we're all together. We had all agreed what we need to do. When we reach a point where my colleagues were no longer moving, when I was at some point given an opportunity to be the president of this country, because I was beginning to implement what I fought for, what I took decision to die for. Once I started, I was criticized.
Some even put allegations of corruption under your tenure.
Exactly. And not a single one has ever produced even a stick of match that I stole anywhere.
Even with the revelations that came out from the State Capture Commission of Inquiry?
There's nothing. Even the man who was reading it has said today it was wrong. That tells you that everything that was done was cooked against me, probably, and other people. Because up to now, with regard to Zuma, nobody has said, this is what Zuma did, which was wrong. Nothing. I have even gone to prison when I've never even appeared before a magistrate, let alone the judge. I served. It was all cooked. So I don't want to get into that one. I'm just telling you why I'm moving.
Who cooked it?
Those who are in power.
You are a political figure that has sources all around the country. You would have insight and some intelligence as to who cooked it.
I'm saying it was cooked by those who are in charge. I don't want to be counting names of people, how many. That's not the issue for me. They know themselves. And those who are helping them, writing news and everybody, they also know.
Let me get this right before we move on to the next point, His Excellency. Are you saying the ANC that you joined before, during the apartheid era and coming into the democratic dispensation, is different from the ANC that you see today?
I was going to come to that, but since you want it now, yes, ANC that I joined is not the ANC that I left. It was a different kind of an ANC. I can say painful things about it. I don't think that is the way to deal with the matter. But to answer your question briefly, yes, the ANC that I joined, that I was prepared to die, that I went in prison for 10 years for, I went into exile for 14 and a half years. It's not the ANC that I left a few years ago. It is a fact. I was trying to make the picture become very clear. That when I joined the ANC, I was clear that I'm prepared to die to liberate my country. And once my country is liberated, how this country will be, how it will be governed, is as clear as anything. I don't want to tell you many other things. Being the former president, I was in a conference where I pulled my hand to make a contribution. And deliberately, I was avoided until I could not put across what I thought. That was not the ANC. In the ANC, every member had the right to speak his mind or her mind. That's no longer the ANC I can talk about. So I don't want to dwell in those because it will make me discuss too many other things that are not that important.
Okay.
Because what I'm trying to say is that the reason why I took a decision is because the ANC was no longer the ANC I knew.
So what is the difference?
I could no longer put an opinion, even if when I put my opinion, it was put aside. And therefore, that is not the ANC. That was not the believing of the ANC that you can be deprived of your views as it is. I wouldn't want to get into that because the point I thought it was important was to say we reached a point where you could no longer do what you were doing when we were ready to die because you were no longer allowed to speak. The kind of leadership that emerged were wrong leadership. Perhaps if you'll be still around when I write my book, you must read it. I might be saying more things in details. What happened to the African National Congress of Tambo Mandela.